Click. So Kim and Bill Meyer.
Yes.
Nice to see you again. We're here in Ohio.
It's good talking with you.
And
Nice to be here with you, Steve.
it's my honor, my pleasure. We're in the hotel after the one-day Human Trafficking Conference that you invited me to come and speak at. Maybe we'll have time to speak about that later, or maybe another time. But I've known you met before at conferences at ICSA and such, and you both were involved with the Worldwide Church of God, and we want to share a little bit of your background story, Kim, and then we'll go to you, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I came into the Worldwide Church of God as an 8-year-old with my mom. My father did not join at that time, so basically was raised in the Worldwide Church of God up to when we exited in the mid-90s, so
In Canada, eh?
in Canada, yeah.
So just to interrupt you for a second, what year, do you remember what year your family entered when you were 8, or am I like dating you?
It would have been the...
You don't want to say.
I want to say 1966, somewhere in there,
Okay.
65, 66.
And the leader of the Worldwide Church of God, for those who are not familiar with it back then, was
Herbert W. Armstrong, Garnerton Armstrong.
Armstrong.
And yes.
Ambassador College and...
At that
Right.
time, there were 3 colleges, Brickwood, England, Big Sandy, Texas, and Pasadena, California.
Yeah, it was Happy Herb and the Holy Honchos. So
Was that something that they referred to while you were a believer, or that's what an ex-member would refer to?
well, that's my cynical description of the
I see, as an ex-member.
as an ex-member.
So tell me that one more time, because it sounded funny.
Well, this will annoy some of the people who are true believers, some of whom live nearby in Wadsworth and are now the disciples of David Pack, who has a sort of Islamic mantra that there is no prophet but Herb, and I am his, or yes, and I am his true disciple.
So Armstrong died, the group splintered, as I understand it, and it went...
Yeah, there are many splinters, and there's the core group led by Joseph Tkach Jr. that has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, but has sort of morphed into kind of generic conservative evangelical Protestant church, mostly worshiping on Sunday, and so those folks would probably not be too offended if I referred to Happy Herb and the Holy Honchos, but many of the others would be, and many of the other groups which are distinguished by worshiping on Saturday and avoiding pork and shellfish and a variety of other distinctives. And from a Christian standpoint, probably emphasizing the Old Testament more than the New. So that would distinguish most of the splinter groups, but would not be descriptive of the Tkach group, which I think has become kinder and gentler, but I don't really understand the insistence by Tkach that he remain the pastor general, and so
I want to get back to Kim. You both of you are fascinating, and you told me that you've been to seminary, you're both trained clinical counselors, you're a pastor in the United Church of Christ now. Fascinating story. There's so many dimensions that I want to touch on. I guess I want to start with you, Kim, to talk about what's it like growing up as a young person
Well,
in the Worldwide Church of God, and anything that you want to say about
Okay.
cults and mind control?
well,
and-
growing up at the time, I didn't view it as a problem because I felt this is just what I'm being acculturated by and
Mhm,
into.
mhm.
I was a good child. I was a very obedient, wanting to please my mother and my father, who, although he was not a member.
Mm.
But then the church itself, I was very in tune with what was required, and I wanted to please. So that was my personality at the time. When I got into high school, I started, we couldn't do things on Saturday. I wasn't allowed to date outside of the church, couldn't wear makeup, had the minister draw lines on my knees where my skirts needed to be.
Mhm.
My mother would frequently bring in ministers and other leaders in the church to mediate arguments between herself and myself.
Mhm.
And I just, at the
Were
time,
you spanked or corporal punishment at all?
corporal punishment was used.
Like spare the rod
Yeah,
and
very
spoil
much
the
so.
child?
I have vivid memories of ministers being in my mother's living room, telling her how to spank my brothers. I didn't get spanked very often because I didn't need to.
You were
I was a pleaser.
good girl.
Mhm.
I was a good girl, but my brothers, yes. And the ministers explaining how my mother needed to do that.
Mhm.
Sometimes it included, you will spank until the child breaks.
Mhm.
And sometimes if that would take 20 spanks, okay, that
Mhm.
didn't matter.
And the group also was heavy on excommunication and
Heavy on
shunning.
excommunication and
If
shunning.
leaders-
Yes.
But one of the things that stands out in my mind as a child growing up is the medical care that was not, was frowned upon.
Yeah, say more about that, please.
Yeah, I think it was by the time my mom came into that group in the mid-1960s, it was a lot stronger in the years preceding that.
You mean more extreme in a
More
negative
extreme,
sense?
right, exactly.
Mhm.
We did go to the doctor on occasion. Of course, we had all had our shots as young children. My mother had her babies in the hospital and that sort of thing, where the trend was to have babies at home, not get shots, for children not to take.
Vaccinations.
Yes, exactly. And so I had a friend that we basically grew up together, and she got Hodgkin's disease when she was 16.
Mm.
And it was very, very much expected that she wouldn't go to a doctor, and she didn't go, and she died within about 9 months within that year.
Did you know that I had Hodgkin's disease
No, I didn't
7
know
years
that.
ago? And had
Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Yeah, lymphoma. I had surgery, 3 months of chemo and radiation, and knock on wood.
And you're still
doing
alive.
7 years later,
And I think
better
my
than I've
friend-
ever been.
Yeah, my friend today would be alive if she had.
Yeah,
had-
so it's a personal
So,
thing when you said that, to
Yeah.
think about a group keeping someone from modern medical care
Right.
because of ideology.
And that
But
stood out.
the irony was that Herbert Armstrong himself got the best medical care,
Mm.
but preached that
You should have faith and have faith healing.
that if you went to the doctor, that you weren't trusting God, and so there was one set of rules for him and a different but more restrictive set of
Yeah,
rules for everybody
that's
else.
Cults 101, standard
Yeah.
operating
Right,
procedure.
right.
Hubbard preached against medical psychiatry and any psychiatric medication, and when he died, his autopsy showed he was on psychiatric medication.
Wow.
So it's very standard.
And I think as I, continued on in my teen years, I would feel bad that I had to be left out of so many things. And so what happened, I just in a kind of a natural way found the things I was good at and did. Didn't really worry too much about conforming. I was really involved in 4-H and dressmaking and those kinds of things at the time. And I did them, and I did them well, and went on to fashion school thinking that I could train people on how to dress in the world tomorrow. That was my way of justifying not being part of the the group of kids that would go to the church's college, which they were the elite kids, and that was kind of what it was expected.
And,
But wasn't the emphasis-
we were told that we were the elite, so there was no mistake.
No, my
in that.
former group was the elite, sorry.
Oh,
We
so- all right.
we were we were the
my.
only true Christians on earth, and
No,
all
we
you
thought we
guys
were,
were
Steve.
taken over by Satan.
No, we thought we
But
were.
I wanted to go back on another theme of what I refer to as Bible cults, and that is the Armageddon and the end is coming, and using that fear to manipulate and control people. Is that present as well?
Very much so, and I think that was what kept me being in conformity with everything, was I felt that if I didn't do things just right, I wouldn't make it into the world tomorrow.
Mm.
Okay.
So the kingdom of heaven would be another term in another group of the
This
world
would be,
tomorrow.
we had the first, second, and third resurrection, and the first resurrection was where we wanted to be. The second resurrection would be where everybody else that has ever lived would find themselves.
Mm.
And those that turned their back on the Worldwide Church of God and God, Herbert Armstrong, would end up in the third resurrection.
Mm.
And I do have very distinct memories of worrying about that. So I would adjust.
A resurrection to be incinerated.
Right, exactly. Annihilated. Be gone, you'd be done. And I always remember adjusting my thinking, anything I wanted to do, any goals I wanted to set for myself, any educational initiatives, or even the idea of dating outside of the Worldwide Church of God would always be tempered with the idea that if I do anything outside of the church's expectations, I could end up in this lake of fire, or third resurrection, or however you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, but I had a lot of questions about the rest of what was going on. And it just sort of sat until we decided to exit many, many years later.
Mm-hmm. And you met inside of the church and married, and I believe, Bill, you were saying your family joined, or your mother joined when you were 16?
Oh no, my
sorry.
family never joined,
Mm-hmm.
and I was sort of a walk-in at age 16 or 17,
Mm-hmm.
and though I wouldn't have admitted,
Walk-in as opposed to recruited in?
well, walk-in as opposed to being born.
Mm-hmm.
So Kim
You
is
were a recruit. in other
I
words.
was a recruit. Kim is a sort of a second generation cult member. So we've had very different experiences
Mm-hmm.
in a sort of a perverse way. My joining the Worldwide Church of God represented a bit of a positive for me, in that there was some individuation. I was separating from parents, and
Mm-hmm.
though I wouldn't have admitted it at the time, there was some adolescent rebellion at
Mhm.
work where
So they told you not to get involved,
where
so
they
that
told me not-
sped you into
so
it.
that pushed me in.
And they also sent you to a psychiatrist to
Um,
sort of reset your thinking.
Well, the psychiatrist was very Freudian
Mm.
in his approach, and the sort of issues that he was looking for didn't really have much traction
Right.
with my experience.
But I'm curious, if I may, just to ask, how did you hear of this, cultic group? Was it someone at school that told you about it, or?
My older brother gave me a crystal radio set for Christmas.
The kind you hook to your mattress,
Oh
the
my
to the spring
goodness.
through your rib.
And
I think Radio Shack, I think I had one of those when I was young too.
yes, and I had a whole series of radios taken away from me, and the Worldwide Church of God, before it adopted the modest title of Worldwide Church of
Mhm.
God, was called the Radio Church of God. And
That's right.
in places like East Texas, where the church had one of its 3 ambassador colleges,
Mm-hmm.
the term on the street for us was radioers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the Radio Church of God.
So you were recruited online, except before the internet.
Well, online, but before it was
Right.
online, it
Right.
was on
Radio.
the radio.
Right.
And it was Herbert W. Armstrong bringing you the good news of the world tomorrow. And
Now,
his...
in contrast, I rarely listen to any of that.
Oh.
Never listen to a broadcast.
So in a sense, you know, it's possible to rebel with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, wild women, and many parents know how to deal with that.
Right.
But what do you do with a son who has God on his side, and of course a magazine proclaiming the plain truth about this or that?
That's what it was called, the plain truth.
It was called the plain truth. And my
Right, well, you can't have it more plain than that. Sorry to make a joke.
I was actually warned pretty clearly by my father, who lived in Germany for a while, and challenged me. He said, you know, these radio broadcasts that you're listening to from Herbert Armstrong and his son Garner Ted Armstrong, he said they really remind me of the Hitler speeches that I used to hear on the radio. And my father said he's using the same techniques. They're basically a series of cliches strung together. And he challenged me to sit down and do an outline of one of the radio broadcasts. And he said, you won't be able to outline a thesis and the development of the thesis. It's just cliches strung together. So I was clearly warned, but I did it anyway. And I went a year to Ohio State University, and then I went to the Church's College in Big Sandy, Texas. And though I was never ordained, I think at some level I was never a fully made guy, if you.
You were pretty made compared to what you've told me.
All right.
So how many years total would you say you both were in before you started exiting?
We began exiting in 95. I think we were totally out by 96. So
for you, that was 30 years,
yeah,
Kim.
Yeah. Well, yeah. For you, I'm not sure I even really think about it much.
Anyway, a long time.
It was for me. It was nearly 3 decades, and I include. There was a screening process before you were allowed to attend worship services. So I'd had some contact with Worldwide Church of God ministers while I was a teenager, and we'd meet sort of furtively at the public library. And then in the 90s, after the death of Herbert Armstrong, I was very briefly asked to plant a congregation of the Worldwide Church of God. And there was a sort of a hierarchy of ordination, and I had never been ordained. But I was ordained as a deacon, but never as a pastor. But sort of paradoxically, I was the pastor of a little Worldwide Church of God congregation in Geneva, Ohio, and I found that the sort of mental tricks that I was playing on myself in justifying behavior and beliefs that I now see were unjustifiable. I found it very difficult to preach those sorts of things to other people. And so the cognitive dissonance kept increasing and increasing. and increasing. And at this point, I went to seminary.
So before you get into the seminary, I just want, for those who are not familiar with the Worldwide Church of God, why, just both of you just comment, why do you think it's a destructive cult? If you do think it's a destructive cult.
The faith, the theology of the Worldwide Church of God, if you look at just what that is all about, you would not be able to say this is a destructive cult.
Okay.
But the culture of the church's congregations and basic infrastructure is what promoted cultic behavior.
So it's not necessarily the theology, it's the
Not
behaviors.
necessarily, but interpretations, patriarchal interpretations, where the man is the head of the wife and that sort of thing. You saw a lot of very strict adherence to those kinds of things. Okay, but then also, you know, the fact that people would be made to feel less than if they didn't conform to some of the theology in its purest sense. And so items like the, you know, or factors, if you will, of such as the medical, that wasn't necessarily a theology. It was a cultural expectation that if you really believed in God,
I thought it was preached.
it was preached.
You should believe, and therefore you will be healed.
It was preached, but it varied too from congregation to congregation.
Okay.
Some ministers would
And-
sort of
and
like
time-
medical
time
theology
to time.
light. You know, it would be, you know, oh well, if you go to a doctor, it's not the best thing, and we really don't think you probably should, but if you do, you do. No, we're not going to think too much of it. Other ministers would say, it's a sin, you need to be, you know, relying
More
on God.
fear and guilt.
And so there was a lot of unevenness, you know, in that regard. And so I guess if you would look at some of that kind of...
So maybe I'm asking the wrong question of why do you think it's a destructive cult. Maybe I should have not interrupted you in your journey, in your description of wanting to learn and understand more and grow and be healthier, I guess.
Well, I think there's a continuum of religious groups, and I'm not sure that there's a sharp and bright line where one would say, well, each group on this side of the line is completely healthy and wholesome, and each group on
I
that
would
side
agree
of the
with you.
line is you know, destructive or of the devil or...
But on the other hand, if a group says we're the only Christians on earth and everyone else is gonna die in Armageddon, that's kind of a tight line.
That's pretty heady stuff to...
That would be...
Or you can't talk to ex-members because they're evil.
That would be an alarm bell. However, every, or at least of the three monotheistic faiths, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, we all have stuff in our core texts, our core stories that can be misused.
Yeah, very problematic
in
if you take it literally.
In very destructive ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's not even a question of literalness or non-literalness. It's a question of are these stories interpreted in a way that empower people or enslave people?
That's a good red line,
right.
enslave or empower. I like that.
Does it encourage people to live up to their full potential, or are people encouraged not to live up to their potential because they're of the wrong
Because they're black and they're Latino, or they're
right.
a female,
Right,
or because
right.
they're gay, to just name a few.
Right. So I think my assessment is that the Worldwide Church of God was not the most destructive of the sort of high demand, high impact groups, but also was not the most benign. And there have been a series of splinter groups since then, some of whom I think are quite destructive, and some of whom I think are more benign. And the degree, I think, to which people are discouraged from thinking for themselves is one of the ways that you would judge, is this group perhaps more benign and
So just in the interest of time, because we could talk forever, and we kind of agreed we'll try to limit this to 45 minutes, which means we have about 20 odd minutes left. What I'd like to ask both of you to think about, because you have fascinating stories, you become counselors, licensed counselors, you've gone to seminary, you're a minister as well as an editor and such. What are some of the key things you'd like to share of your journey that might be helpful to someone watching this?
Well, for me.
Did you want to go first?
No, he'll go first.
Okay. You weren't just deferring to him because you were raised in a culture where the guy goes first. I'm just teasing.
No. I'm
Teasing
so I
you.
can go ahead.
Well, one of the things that we've had to do is to sort of renegotiate our relationship.
Right.
Because when we were in the Worldwide Church of God, the ideology and theology of the church, even though I considered myself a fairly progressive, if that word can really be used.
Sure, why not?
A more thoughtful than most member of the Worldwide Church of God.
That's why you weren't ordained.
That's why I wasn't
In my
ordained.
opinion.
I asked
Too many questions.
Too many questions, and was never a completely trustworthy cult member.
Well, you weren't dependent and obedient enough.
But
I'm sorry.
I know.
It's your story.
We did spend, and I think are continuing in a healthy way to renegotiate our marriage, and that's been both a scary but a joyous process, and so people who leave destructive groups like the Worldwide Church of God and its many offshoots can't anticipate having to reassess and renegotiate major relationships.
I'd like to speak to that a little bit.
Please.
One of the challenges for us in that period of time was to truly acknowledge where the other person was at. And because I think we were in seminary at that time, Bill had started his counseling 10 years well, and I started within a year or two after that, which was helping us get some insight into these processes. But one of the things that we really had to acknowledge was where the other person was at developmentally, and that got scary at times.
Right.
Because I would be thinking through just how horrendous my experience was in terms of my identity formation. And also my realizing how much I had shelved or ignored goals that I might have had otherwise. It got down to asking ourselves, did we marry the right people? And should we start all over with someone else now, or get out of this relationship?
Sort of trade me in for a better, shinier model.
Yeah, but also to
Not
just say the
necessarily.
obvious, you have
Yeah.
children together,
We
so
did have
that
children. We
you
did
had
have children.
obligations and
We had a lot of
connections.
commitments at that time. And it was scary because developmentally I might have been one way 1 month, but another way in another place 3 months later. And this poor guy is wondering what's going on now, and vice versa. He was also going through his stuff. So we not only had to hold our own stuff, but we had to hold the other person's. And that took a lot of lot of work, and a lot of re-examining of our commitments and what they were based on.
So when you were first exploring leaving, at what point did you start learning about cults and exploring that, or was it more theology first? To
It was
just see what is
theology first.
what is the Bible teaching and how is it different from the claims?
For
of
me,
the-
it was theology. I was starting to have real big doubts about, when the church started going through its theological sort of earthquake in the mid-90s and came out the other side as this evangelical kind of mishmash, and away from the, strict Sabbatarian kinds of things. I started to really question, well, what is this all about? Okay, but didn't quite know what to do with all of that either.
Right.
Was I just going to accept all of this? Well, okay, maybe not. And then I have memories of being, somehow somebody dropped Paul Martin's name and Wellspring into our laps. And so then we decided if...
Paul is an ex-member who became
No.
a psychologist,
Yes,
who opened Wellspring Retreat Center.
Right.
He's since passed away, unfortunately.
Now,
Right.
not a member of the Worldwide Church of God, but of another
Bible cult.
Bible cult that I discovered many of these groups, even though their theologies may be slightly different, function under the same ground rules, basically. So I began to realize that even though the Worldwide Church of God had a very distinctive theology, yet at a kind of cultural level, it was largely indistinguishable from other cultic groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Way International. And if there's anyone watching this video who is currently involved with the Worldwide Church of God, or I guess more germanely, its offshoots that still hew to the faith one once delivered to Herbert Armstrong, I would make a theological challenge, and because this was my exit route. But I would encourage people to actually exercise the Herbert W. Armstrong test. In his broadcasts, he would say over and over again, "Don't believe me, believe your Bible." Now, once in the church,
I'm sorry for
Once-
laughing. There's so many
I
Bible
know.
cult leaders who say the exact
Right,
same
right.
thing.
Because they
Right.
understand paradox, that's why.
But that's an option that's only open to people who are outside the group. Once you're inside, now no one tells you it's time to switch off the Herbert Armstrong test, but you're very much discouraged from thinking for yourself.
But it's very, intoxicating when you're being recruited.
Right.
See, he's challenging
Right,
me
right.
to
It's-
study the Bible.
It sounds good. But the three books of the New Testament that the Worldwide Church of God stayed away from the most were the book of Hebrews, the book of Galatians, and the book of Romans. And I would challenge that if members of the Worldwide Church of God really want to live by every word of God, you need to read and deal seriously with the whole document. For instance, in the book of Galatians, you'll discover that Paul forbids Jewish religious practices for Christians in an all-Gentile environment. Very early Christian document. And then if you move to Galatians, you'll discover that Paul now tolerates in the letter to the Romans what he forbids in Galatians. And this just makes some people go nuts when they realize Galatians, this behavior is forbidden, but in Romans, this behavior is permitted and tolerated because the cultural situation is different. And one of the scriptures that I think I found most persuasive in persuading me that the Worldwide Church of God, as it then existed, was being, if not dishonest, at least was mistaken, was Romans 14 and 15, where Paul clearly talks about two groups of people who have very different beliefs. One group of people believing that one day of the week is special, another group believing that all days are the same. And then you or I would have expected Paul to come down on one side or the other of the debate, but he says, let everyone be fully convinced in their own mind. And that is a powerful, powerful passage
And if I might
that
sum that
encourages us to think for ourselves.
Exactly. And so that's what we did as a couple. And for me to think for myself and determine my future in a very independent way was very foreign.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, Bill was growing at the same time and developing his own way of understanding all of this and was very supportive.
But our paths were very different.
Very different, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point where we had to reaffirm our vows, our marriage vows and those kinds of things. And for him to go off now and do his vocational calling as a pastor, that's not me.
Mm-hmm.
So at one time though, he would have been very threatened by that. And I remember, fortuitously, I found a therapist that I was able to talk to very early on, and he said, well, Bill can always take a blow-up doll that can sit and do this in the pew.
A Bobo doll.
Yeah, and and he doesn't need you. So this has been a very, if you want to consider developmental issues, I've been an adolescent for the last, 15, 20 years. And
that's what I want you to both take a moment, but start with you, Kim, to talk as a clinician, as a licensed mental health counselor, addiction specialist. You've studied developmental psychology, you've studied trauma treatment. Now, from this perspective of 2014, looking at environments like the one that you were raised, say a few words about what's going on.
You mean with me personally right now?
Looking back as a clinician, and just to generalize to other children raised in similar type environments.
Okay. Well, I feel like
is it healthy for them, and if not, why not? And what's
for them to be in those environments?
Yeah.
Well, those environments their development in those environments is going to be restricted. They're going to stagnate. They're going to regress, whatever by the group's ideology, whatever it happens to be, and how they play that out culturally. And so those children their identity is going to be rooted in that, and not in their own self-development for their own potential.
That's our biggest regret, is the harm that was done to our children, because in some sense we had the agency, and we could have exited. But
if you weren't under mind control, from my point of view.
Right.
Social influence was very strong.
Our children had even less agency, and that's where the real damage
and I believe our oldest child, now looking back on his life and looking at where he is now and the things he's gone through, and looking at that from a clinician's perspective, he had to go through a developmental time in his 20s that he probably should have been going through when he was 13 and 14. Has he come out well now? Yes, but it's been a tough road, and I recognize that. And so for us as adults now, and I mean we are, heading down the other side of the the hill here. Developmentally, I in many ways look at myself professionally now, and I think if I'd been where I am now in my 20s.
Where would you be now?
Where would I be now?
Yeah, no,
and
you're very bright,
I recognize
you're very talented.
the forces that kept me where I was. Now, I made choices to marry, to have children, to kind of restrict the time and money and those kinds of flows that I had at the time. So developmentally, I'm very aware of what has to happen, but that's okay. People can overcome. They're resilient.
Yeah, it's amazing how resilient people are.
And you use your narrative. This becomes your narrative, that you pull out what worked well, okay, and you build it into where you are now.
But I think we're going to find out as more research is done with actual fMRIs and such
Yeah,
of children
right,
who are
right.
raised in environments where they are in such fear that the world's going to end at any moment, or they're in so much, they're being physically punished,
Yeah.
in some cases with sticks, with belts,
Right.
not just with hands, isolated from friends,
Right.
sports.
They become hardwired to be very, how should I say it? Their hardwiring is set in such a way that their potential is going to be very limited or very difficult to overcome as well.
And,
Let me see some-
and we've talked about the psychology of influence, and if there's anyone listening to this who is in a position of leadership in one of these groups,
And not just Worldwide Church of
Right,
God,
right.
Splinter,
and
any
if you're
church.
if you're
or any
if you're
group.
thinking about leaving, let me grant permission to you to use your influence to also grant permission to think for yourself to the people for whom you have significant influence. So when I left the Worldwide Church of God, I was the pastor of a small congregation in Geneva, Ohio. We actually, for reasons that would take too long to explain, we were the only congregation that had congregational governance in a church that was more hierarchical than the Catholic Church. But
Which you thought was totally satanic and evil, if I remember correctly.
more or less. But when I left, rather than just going away quietly into the night, which is the way the Worldwide Church of God would have preferred it to happen, I granted permission for the congregation to make up its own mind. And I essentially said, I can't decide for you what you're going to do, but I'm resigning as pastor, and these are the reasons. I've concluded that this is destructive for me, and my staying in this role is doing harm to you, but I believe you guys as a congregation also have the right to make up your own mind what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the congregation...
Very progressive
the-
of you.
Maybe.
But I would challenge you on the term granting permission, because
Well-
from my ears, it's like, I would say to anybody, listen, God wants us to be ourselves. If he wanted Adam and Eve to be robots, he would have made them
we have...
dependent, obedient robots.
Right. We have permission, but we often need to be reminded.
Ah.
And
So he's reminding you
people,
that God gave you permission to use your own mind. 'Cause
Right.
That's part of the divine
but
plan.
all of us to one degree or another do have influence on other people. And
Sure.
even in that exit process, which can be very tough, you can make a real gift to other people by, because once you're out, your influence over the people who stay is largely gone. You'll be
Well, you're shunned.
you'll be shunned or excommunicated, or some other narrative about, what a rotten guy Bill Meyer was will be constructed. But while you're in that point of transition, granting permission to others to decide for themselves can be really powerful. And what happened in our situation was that Saturday, and I did not call the meeting, I did not run the meeting, I did not convene the meeting. The congregation voted after discussion, and I think it was like 2-1. So 2/3 of the congregation said, we're out of here as well. Now, they wanted me to remain as pastor of an independent church, and I decided no, I would not do that, because the the chances would be very high that we would just replicate the old system.
That's a very insightful. That's exactly what happens when people
Right.
splinter. They want to do it better, but then they're still programmed with the same
Right.
patterns.
It would have a different name, it
Right.
would have a different, some slightly different rules,
Right.
but at depth, it
Mhm.
would be the same system with just a change of clothing.
Mhm.
So what I said after the congregation made its decision,
Mm.
I said, I will remain, but only if I'm an interim pastor, and only if you guys agree that we will find
You
a...
guys and girls, or just guys, or were you still stuck in the male only thing?
Well, guys is sort of a, if you've been to high school, the girls call each other guys, so that's
Okay.
a sort of
Okay.
a gender neutral term
I was a
these
little
days.
bit just kind of toying around with you.
But if you guys and gals
Mm-hmm.
will find a healthy denomination
Mm-hmm.
that can give us some accountability. So we became very briefly the Geneva Independent Christian Congregation, and we went and auditioned denominations. So we had
In other words, you
offers.
were a good consumer and you started
Right,
interviewing
right.
to
And-
find out what was healthy for you.
And people who are leaving cults, if they want to find another church, and I don't think that's required, sometimes taking a break can be helpful.
It's very
but
wise advice,
if you're,
actually.
if you're looking for another church, grant yourself permission to go and interview the pastor
Mhm.
or interview people in the church before you join. That's okay.
And look for former members and why they left. That's a good clue.
And if they don't want to be interviewed, I think they're giving you some powerful
Warning
information.
signs.
And
Warning, warning.
go look somewhere else. So
Yeah,
we
ask a lot of pointed questions.
Ask-
You don't get very direct answers. That's
ask
also
questions. Ask questions, and sometimes the questions are as important, if not more important, than the answers.
Mhm.
Because sometimes, as we discover, what we think is the answer turns out not to be. But the question is really, really important. And frankly, the narratives of Scripture involve lots of questions and invite us to analyze, to interpret, to try to make sense of things. So we ended up with offers of political asylum, and that's the right word, from the United Church of Christ, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I think the Methodists. And for us, the Christian Church Disciples turned out to be the best choice.
Mhm.
So we
In other
stayed.
words, they respected where you were at. They weren't
respected our
giving you a
journey
black
too.
and white doctrine dogma that you had to be
But yet,
obedient
but
to.
right, but yet the disciples were very smart about both questions of pastoral abuse,
Mhm.
and they wanted to make sure that did not take place,
Mhm.
and they gave us some real accountability and real help.
Mhm.
And so we stayed together as a congregation for about 2 years.
Mhm.
And then we realized, this congregation, though we were based geographic,
Geographically,
geographically.
yeah.
unless it's a rock
Right.
church,
right.
which
We-
could be.
We did rock for a while,
Mm.
but though we had a geographical center, we were coming from, 3 or 4 different counties.
Which was
2
typical
states.
worldwide Church of God
This is-
style too.
But
Mhm.
we had no real roots in that community. So we were not shrinking, but we were not growing. So we entered a period of discernment where we tried to look at ourselves and where we were, and
Mhm.
we'd worked through many of the spiritual abuse questions, and we discerned that it was God's will that we dissolve the congregation and try to get everyone hooked up in a more or less healthy congregation in their own community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
It's a
our
healing
story.
journey for the
And,
group, and it was a healthy one.
Mm-hmm. So we're gonna need to wrap up in a few minutes, but I guess I wanna ask you both if you have any advice to someone who was raised in a splinter group of the Worldwide Church of God, whose family is still in, who is shunning.
Be true to themselves if they're in the process of leaving. Be true to themselves. Be
Well, what does that
kind.
mean to be true to yourself?
Be-
If
to
your
be a
heart
person-
is wrenching, you miss your siblings, your parents, you
Those are
want
the-
to talk to them, you want to be with them, and they're giving you the cold shoulder.
Find your own support system
Mm.
and give yourself permission to do that.
Mm.
Get some help. Try to find someone you can talk to who will understand you.
Mhm.
There are ways of resources that can lead you to the kind of people that you would be finding the most helpful in that regard. Also, just not be afraid to go ahead with your own thinking, ability to think independently, and have faith in the process that's going to probably be the right thing for you. And everybody is different.
Mhm.
Everybody's situation is different. Your family of origin issues, even
Mhm.
within the church,
Mhm.
are very much different as well.
Mhm.
There were stable families in the church, there were unstable families
Right.
for whatever other reasons that were going on. So
Mhm.
everybody is different. And I think that's all I can say is just feel your
What
way.
about you, Bill? Any words, any thoughts that you would like to share? Because for me, it's one of the most horrendous abuses of any religion, Jewish cults,
Yes.
Christian cults, Hindu
Yeah.
cults, whatever,
Mhm.
where the family turns their back on their loved ones and says,
Yeah.
if you don't conform and agree to what we say is the truth, we can't have a relationship with you. It's so the opposite of my understanding of the divine and the
Becomes
spiritual
relationship
journey.
trauma. It is very, very significant.
The shunning piece, not only in the Worldwide Church of God, but with the Amish and Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups, it's
The
a
Mormons do it too.
it's a powerful method of social control, but I guess as painful as it is at the time, don't give up on other human beings, and you will make other friends,
Mhm, right.
and you'll discover that you will make friendships that are not contingent on membership in the group. I deceived myself when I left the Worldwide Church of God. I felt, well, my friendships in the group are so deep and so significant that they'll certainly survive my leaving, because people will realize that I left for reasons of conscience and
Out of strength, out of integrity, out of goodness.
well, at least, I don't know about goodness, but at least for reasons of conscience. And but I found that with one or two exceptions, that was not true, and that the friendships that I had prized were all contingent friendships, and that was extremely painful.
That also
For
for
me.
me too. Right?
Mm.
That was a
And if I can speak for Kim, which I hope to
It's
get
okay.
That's fine, yes.
absolution
We
for.
understand each other well enough that I think I know what
now.
he's going to say, yes, now, yeah.
After,
Yeah.
Kim was very angry with me for initially leaving the Worldwide Church of God, because she realized that this would mean the loss of all of her significant friendships. And for months, if not a couple of years afterwards, Kim had a persistent nightmare that went something like this. Kim would be walking in the shopping mall nearby, and all of her significant friends and acquaintances would be walking in the other direction, passing Kim, and they would all turn their eyes and avert their eyes and avoid acknowledging Kim. So, and that was very, very painful. But given time and you know, don't go back to the group, you'll get beat up again. But there are people out there who will become your friends. You will make new friendships that are not contingent. They'll feel somewhat different. They may not have the same false intensity that some of our friendships in the group had, but these will be people who will stand by you in ways that are not conditional on membership in the group.
And I want to just really underscore, because this is such an important point, because when I was in the Unification Church, the Moonies, part of the promotion of it and the recruitment into it is that we have love. We have God's love on a higher level than exists in any other church on the planet, because we have God's unconditional love.
Right.
And it's in the book, The Divine Principle, the Theology.
Right.
Higher standard of love, and exactly what you were saying, in reality, in practice, it's completely conditional love based on doing what they tell you to do, and the minute you start questioning or saying, no, I will not turn my back on a homeless person who is needing my assistance, which actually happened. I was yelled at by my superior. So all of my friends, and I totally agree with you, there was this false intensity because we were the elite, we were saving the world, Armageddon was going to happen. You have this kind of combat camaraderie that we're on the front lines for God against Satan, and then you leave and it's like, wow, like just having friends and hanging out, and like you don't have this huge intensity, but it's real.
And you have to renegotiate your friendships based on where you are at that time and where you're moving forward from and into, and that is, I'm not going to say that that's easy. That's very difficult. It is difficult.
And for those who do find another church, you may find that, and we sort of kidded ourselves in a good way by talking about joining a normal dysfunctional church. So that's kind of an insider joke, but non-cultic, non-abusive churches may not have the sort of intensity drug that groups like the Unification Church and the Worldwide Church of God had, where we could savor a sense of specialness, which ultimately became a kind of idolatry, where it was a covert sort of group self-worship, and by identifying ourselves in the special group, we could be special.
It's a narcotic.
It's a narcotic.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
It's a drug, but when you leave the church...
But I wouldn't leave the leader who claims to be the prophet or to know the special scriptures and the God's true way as part of that formula.
Right, so I would recommend a non-profit synagogue, or a non-profit church, or a non-profit
where you can actually look at the accounting records,
and
donation.
It may not have the same, and it probably will not have the same feeling of intensity. And people who leave a group like us may comment, and we may feel that there's something
Something missing.
lacking. but it's just getting used to the normal conditions of human beings in a normal, non-toxic, non-exploitive, non-special, and therefore non-idolatrous faith community. So that sense of specialness, when you don't have it, may be off-putting, but I think it's really a good thing.
So I want to keep going a little bit more because I think that we're talking about such important material. I come across a lot of folks who have been so burned, so abused in a Bible,
Right.
what I would refer to as a destructive cult, that they can't even open a Bible, they can't even think about ever being part of a faith community again.
Right.
I'm interested in what both of you might share, and my position is it's your mind that you need to think for yourself and make your own decisions. I have a bias as a family therapist to kind of go back to the roots that you were raised with. If you were brought in at 16, like what was that about?
Right.
Our
So a
journeys
Jew
were very
would look at Judaism, or a
Right.
Catholic would go to the Catholic Church, not to join it, but just to re-explore it, because so many of these groups alienate people against.
Our journeys were very different because I had nothing to go back to.
Mhm.
Bill was able to think in terms of going back to his Presbyterian roots.
Mhm.
I was baptized as an Anglican, but really don't have any memories of, it was mostly all Worldwide Church of God memories. And so when I went to seminary, my motivation
What
was
seminary did you attend?
Ashland Theological Seminary.
Did you both go to the
We
same
both
one?
went to the same one.
And what orientation, denomination?
It's Brethren, but it's a conservative.
But it's an accredited seminary.
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it also offered the clinical track for counseling, which we
I
both
see.
ended up with. But my thinking at the time was I needed to study scripture, study theology, study church history. I was particularly interested in church history for myself, for the ability.
I recommend it to all my clients to study the history of religion.
But I was very fortunate. I had some very good professors that understood where I was coming from, and they took the time, even though they didn't necessarily agree with me, but they took the time to listen to my discussions about where I'd come from, where I was going. If I had a New Testament paper that I was writing and I was really struggling with trying to get my mind wrapped around what I thought about the subject and where I had come. They really took the time, and they allowed me that, they granted me that, and that was therapeutic in and of itself, that I could think through and ask questions about the Bible without being shut down or put in a box or countered with arguments that represented this narrow thinking from the church I had been in. And that was a wonderful experience.
So they weren't trying to make you conform.
No, absolutely not. But however, Ashland Theological Seminary for me at the time was conservative enough that I wasn't put off by, because I wasn't completely out of some of the mindsets that I had,
staunch mindsets.
Yeah. And so after that process was over, in the subsequent years, I have continued to evolve where I am spiritually. And where I am now is much different than where I was when I graduated from seminary. But that was the process that allowed some of these other processes to continue, and it's been wonderful for me to say, I don't want to go to church today because I'm extremely tired after a very long week at work.
Well,
and
God
God
will
will
punish you that.
but I don't have to worry about God punishing me. But letting go of those thought burdens that was a process. And so now today, Bill and I am one place, Bill is another place, and it's okay, it's good.
When I say one place, I mean different churches you attend?
Not necessarily, just in our spiritual outlooks in a lot of things.
Actually necessarily, and that's I think a useful that's a useful point, that after taking a break from pastoring because the exit process was very, very intense. And I continued in seminary, and Kim had just, I think, started, but we were just ordinary church members in an ordinary church for about 4 years, and we let the church minister to us, and that was a necessary time. And then I received a calling to a little congregation of the Christian Church Disciples as the part-time pastor, and I was there for about 6 years. But Kim initially joined the church that I was pastoring, and then found, and this was a little difficult for me at the time, but I think it was a healthy decision for Kim. She came to the point where she said, you know, and I paraphrasing what she told me.
Yeah, I know what you're gonna say.
In essence, she said, Bill, I love you very much, but you cannot be both my husband and my pastor. And so Kim then began interviewing and auditioning churches, and found another congregation of another denomination that at the time was a little more progressive than I was on a couple of issues, and joined that congregation. And I think that was an absolutely outstanding move for Kim, because then there was no falsehood. She wasn't putting up appearances. She wasn't trying to please me, or even worse, please other people in the congregation that I was leading, which is...
And also a good role model for your kids. To
Right.
see parents are together, but they're believing
Right.
different things and doing
Well, for them, that's
So,
significant.
very
Given
important.
the way they were raised, yes.
Yeah.
I'm actually now an associate member of the congregation that Kim joined, and I'm hoping I don't spoil it for her, but I continue to have a membership in a Disciples of Christ congregation, and actually I found myself adopting, and one of the key questions was the openness of God to LGBT people, and Kim was honestly there before
Many years
I
before
was,
you.
but her path in getting there was very different from my path. So I have to say that at times I've kind of led the way spiritually, probably out of the WCG, but there are times in our relationship where I think Kim's influence has kind of led the way.
She's very smart.
She is, and she's very good
She's got a
at
great
what she
heart.
does professionally and in many other ways.
So, we're going to wrap up momentarily, but just say something about where learning about other cults fit in your journey of healing. Because you talk mostly about seminary and theology, but
Well, I think
you also
about-
described that you would go to conferences and meet ex-members of other groups.
We became involved with ICSA in the mid-90s, just as we were on the verge of exiting the Worldwide Church of God. And I think we started mentioning earlier in the interview, learning about Paul Martin and
Right.
learning about, through ICSA, and then Ron Burke's, talking to them both at one point, and from that point the whole world opened up to us.
Ron Burks is a psychologist who
Yes,
himself was in
yes,
a Bible
yes.
type cult, who's now down
Yeah,
in Florida.
and we started to read and learn more about all these different groups and dynamics, if you will, and went to ICSA conferences and started networking, talking to different people, and have developed a fairly substantial library. And the clients that I work with, I recognize. Much of the kinds of things that I went through, and I'm able to relate to them.
And
professionally.
speaking about your clients, you contacted Mike Langoni, the director of ICSA, regarding an upcoming conference in D.C. about human trafficking, because you have people coming to be your program. Could you say a little bit about what patterns you might have observed in some human trafficking victims that reflect
Well,
cultic patterns?
I can basically just speak from my brief experience at Beech Brook, where I work now as the director of outpatient therapy and AOD services. We started, receiving into our residential program children that we knew were trafficked, and working with other therapists and directors at Beech Brook, realizing that there is a lack of understanding of the coercion process that is a big piece of the trafficked victims' experience. And the reason I contacted Michael Langoni was wondering if there was anybody in ICSA that has been onto that and connecting the dots, so to speak. And he obviously
That's
put
how
me
we
in touch with
reconnected.
you, and I was so excited.
And I was excited to learn about
Yeah.
you because you are overseeing this huge clinical program.
Right.
And for me, it's just so obvious that pimps and traffickers are like cult leaders who
That's
are...
exactly right, and I recognize that
And the
immediately.
cult
It's
leaders
not-
are like pimps and traffickers.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
the,
Yeah,
that's
maybe-
the useful
Maybe
piece.
Moses David Berg was the most famous
Yeah.
cult leader who actually sent his women out as prostitutes to make money and recruit
But-
followers
But Herbert
and
W.
abuse children.
But Herbert W. Armstrong and Garner Ted Armstrong were both sex offenders, and that's been thoroughly documented.
Really?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's been
Both of them.
I've
thoroughly
forgotten about
documented.
that.
And for someone to be in a group that claims that Happy Herb was God's end time prophet, you just can't reconcile that with the kind of
Well, my former cult leader too, by the way,
Right.
Yeah.
and many other cult leaders, use of
in-
power, sex, money.
God does not use people who have incest with their children
Mm.
and are serial adulterers as
They can't be the prophet and run
I-
thousands and thousands of people's lives and tell them what's moral. Why? Why not?
Well, yeah.
Give
That-
your tithe. Give your hundreds of thousands of dollars to
Send-
him so he can
send
live in a
all-
multi-million-dollar house.
all of your money to box 111 in Pasadena,
Well,
California.
Steve, back to your ending point.
Mm.
I think it's vital that agencies such as the agency I work at, where we are seeing more and more of these trafficked kids, understands the elements of mind control, the social influence, destructive influence spectrum, in order to be able to better treat these children. We are trauma experts, and we're very good at that.
Mm.
We're very good at understanding the bigger picture, but that piece is missing, and I think it's a big piece that we need to work on with.
But our work together,
yeah.
I'm hoping is going to bear fruit, where you can take your life experience of being in a cult and your seminary training and your clinician's training and learning about cults and mind control, and we can craft some programs that are actually going to help victims of trafficking in a very real way.
Right.
And empower them as we are trying to empower people leaving cultic groups so that they don't go back to their trafficker
Well, and
and are abused.
empower the workers that I have direct relationships with also. They're the ones that we need to develop. I need to work personally developing some training for them at Beech Brook
Mhm.
to help them understand this a little bit in more depth and to become more sensitized to that dynamic.
Yeah, and we need to develop some model programs and then train people around the country and around the world, I think.
Yeah, I
This
think
is-
so.
It's estimated there's 21 to 27 million people in the world right now who are
Absolutely.
slaves or being trafficked.
Both to the sex slave
labor.
and the labor slavery, yeah,
Right.
right.
Did you want to finish us up?
Well, I wanted to pick up on
Mm.
your final question as well.
Mm.
I think there are 2 points that stand out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And one is that looking at other abusive groups helped me to see that my experience, which is often when we exit from these groups, we have a difficult time even finding a vocabulary to describe
That's right.
what has happened to us.
Mhm.
And so that to be able to say that, Steve, your experience in the Moonies was similar to my experience in the Worldwide Church of God in this way, and this way, and this way, it both gives me language and a vocabulary to discuss and to process, and that's really important, the processing. What is it that happened? And to talk about it and to come to terms with it. But it also focused me on the fact that it's often the culture more than the beliefs
Mhm.
of the groups that really do the harm.
Emphasis on culture.
Culture, well,
Totalistic culture.
but the way, the practice of the group is often more important than the beliefs.
Absolutely.
Lots of people can have sort of offbeat beliefs that don't really do much harm. And
I agree.
A group like Christian Science, I wouldn't want to be a kid growing up without medical care, but
Don't start me with Christian Science,
All
because
right.
I've learned too much about them, and it's not a healthy environment.
But I think that's less unhealthy than the Moonies, and the odd beliefs.
Depends on the year, I guess.
Odd beliefs in and of and by themselves aren't necessarily toxic, but the way those beliefs are practiced is where the real harm is done.
Mhm.
And in the counter-cult movement, especially church-based groups often focus almost exclusively on doctrinal questions and miss the abusive culture.
Mhm.
So one of the benefits of looking at lots of groups is that for me, it allows me because there's a continuum of abuse,
Right.
to even look at fairly normal church systems.
And say they're dysfunctional and
Well,
possibly.
and say now, here's something that's beginning to happen that if we allow it to continue, could do
Mhm.
real harm. So I think the experience in a destructive cult has sensitized me to issues of abuse, and it's also forced me to think in less black and white terms. So
Mhm.
when I was in the group, everything was completely good or completely bad,
Mhm.
as opposed to there being a sort of gray scale.
Right.
And I notice even in very good, what I would consider to be good and healthy systems, there can be toxic leadership issues that need to be
Definitely.
addressed and minimized. And also, even in a toxic group, not everything is bad.
Mhm.
Not everything that I
Agreed.
experienced in the Worldwide Church of God, and I suspect even in the Moonies,
Exactly.
not everything that you experienced was 100% bad.
Nothing's
So
100%.
there are some things that I experienced in the Worldwide Church of God that I still value.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to go back, and I don't want to rejoin a group like that, but looking at other groups has helped me to, I think for myself and apply a more informed and kind of nuanced worldview
Exactly.
to my life and ministry.
And we have
This-
kinship with the entire world now, not just with the Worldwide Church of God.
Yeah, right.
was-
You're a human being,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
more of a love-based model about
Yeah.
God than fear and guilt.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So on
And,
that note, I think that's probably the most important point for both of us.
Yeah, love is the greatest force, and my experience with people trapped in mind control groups, if the people genuinely care and respect them and love them, it's
Mhm.
such a powerful force. It's
Mhm.
not arguing theology, not
No.
even talking about the bite model and mind control,
Right.
but just saying, hey, you're special, you're important, I love
Unconditional
you.
human regard.
And
kind
you deserve to
regard.
have better life.
Yeah.
You can be doing so much more to manifest the potential that you were born with.
Right,
And
absolutely.
if you believe in God, that God wants you.
Right.
And I love working with clients to that end.
Mhm.
It's what fuels me,
Mhm.
keeps me going.
Well, it's a pleasure, and to get to know you a little bit better, and I'm hoping this will be a beginning of a bigger collaboration.
Yeah,
And
I'm looking forward to it.
and thank you. I hope this was helpful.
And you guys will do well at your presentation at the next conference.
I know
Yeah,
and you'll
and-
be in the audience rooting.
And
Okay.
we'll say goodbye,
Bye.
and next time. Bye.
Right.
Thank you again.
Oh.